Jason Bowers. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at NowAware. And I just want to take you guys through what we're doing, why we think it's really important. And, we are in the process of fundraising. And so I'll also talk a little bit about the fundraising that we're looking for and what we plan to do with it. So let's start out by looking at what's on the title slide. So here's a representation of a crystal structure of a protein. This protein is a protease neutrophil elastase. So for those of you who aren't familiar, proteases are proteins that break down other proteins. And this particular one plays a really important role in lung damage that arises in certain types of chronic pulmonary disease. And as I'm going to show you over the course of the next few slides, neutrophil elastase and proteins like it represent a unique opportunity to fill a critical diagnostic gap in healthcare for diseases that cost in the US and EU alone $100 billion a year in expenses. So chronic pulmonary disease. I think the real takeaway message for a chronic pulmonary disease is it's a huge problem. It affects approximately 15% of the adult population of the US. That's split more or less equally between asthma and COPD. We are focused on COPD. COPD costs, as I mentioned before, in the US and EU, their healthcare systems, $97 billion, so $100 billion a year. It is the third leading cause of non-accidental death in the US. It's responsible for lots of physician visits, ER visits, hospitalizations, and a lot of unnecessary sufferings I'll describe as we go along. So COPD is a disease that has two aspects. It's got a chronic aspect to it, a slowly building, ongoing aspect, and an acute aspect. So the chronic disease side of it, it is this irreversible, progressive disease that results in the loss of lung capacity over time. And as you guys are probably aware, the disease correlates very strongly with tobacco smoking and chronic exposure to pollution, to industrial solvents and other things like that. What you may not be aware of is that there's actually a very strong genetic component for about 1% of the people with COPD. These are people who have never smoked, who have never been exposed to these other environmental contaminants. And the interesting thing about this is what gene this genetic deficiency is in, and it's the alpha-1 antitrypsin gene. And not that you're supposed to know exactly what that means, but it is a protein that inhibits proteases. So now we have this interesting link between COPD and proteases, and we'll continue to build up on that link as we go along. But keep that in mind. So the acute aspect of COPD is the one that we're focused a little bit more on. So exacerbations are these acute events. This is an acute worsening of symptoms of the typical COPD symptoms. So you can think about it as this long road with a slight upward grade, and then there's these sudden big increases along the way. This typically happens because of lung infections or exposure to irritants. 70% of the healthcare costs in the US are related to exacerbations. That is an enormous fraction of a really, really large number. And the important thing to take that into consideration of that is that most exacerbations, most of the sources of that 70% of healthcare costs, could be mitigated or avoided if the physician was aware of an impending exacerbation. That's a really important notion, that if you just knew about it, you could avoid it. And that's 70% of the cost of the healthcare system. Obviously, we don't have diagnostics today that address that particular problem. So I'm going to step back and talk about protease function in a normal lung and protease function in a COPD lung, and talk about the differences between them. So if we look at the lungs on the left, we've got a patient with pneumonia. He's got an infection of Streptococcus pneumoniae, and the body turns the proteases that are in the lungs, it turns them on. And those proteases go in and chew up the bacteria and clear the infection. And then once that infection is over, the body re-regulates those proteases and turns them off. So that's the normal situation. Under normal circumstances, healthy, no infection, proteases are off. When you get an infection, the proteases come on, clear the infection, and turn off. That's the way it's supposed to work. However, in a COPD lung, things have gone a bit awry. So the patient has no infection, but there's protease activity currently on. And so in the absence of bugs and bacteria to chew up, it's instead chewing up the lung itself, the extracellular matrix of the lung itself. And that is driving that loss of lung capacity over time. So as COPD progresses, you get more protease activity, and a consequence is the loss of lung capacity. So in addition to that chronic component of it, the slow building, when a COPD lung is challenged with an infection, you see sort of an overreaction, and those are the things that you get people hospitalized for. That's what you get people in the emergency room for. They can't breathe anymore because the body is basically overreacting, and massive spikes of this protease activity is occurring again. So the solution that we are proposing is to develop a rapid, simple to use point of care device that assesses the activity of proteases in the lung. And we believe, we have good reason to believe, we feel that we may be able to use a simple nasal swab sample instead of either a blood sample or a sputum sample. This gives a really big advantage when you're talking about point of care and unsupervised sample collection. The one thing about COVID is that people have really learned how to do nasal swabs for themselves. We can take advantage of that here. Now, I put on this slide examples of 4 different point of care devices. Mostly just to show you what the commonalities are between them. You've got instrument hardware, instrument software, and a consumable. And consumable is like a little cartridge that goes into the machine. You put your sample in there, all the chemistry necessary for the assay is on there. You get an answer out the other side. So the other reason I put this on there is to emphasize the fact that this is a wheel that's been made several times. Nobody needs to really reinvent it. And so it's certainly our preference to go forward with a partner who already has a platform where we have substantial placement of instruments. And I'll come back to that a little bit later as well. So what would we do with this test? So we see that there's basically 5 applications for the test. Simple diagnosis of COPD. Does this individual who hasn't been diagnosed before, does he have COPD? Determine the stage and progression. So once you have a baseline, what is the deviation from that baseline over time? And see how that correlates with the treatment regimen, and giving opportunities to change treatment along the way. The others that we have here are really around exacerbations. And this is an area where there aren't any diagnostics today. There is no way to really do this. So the first is to detect a current exacerbation. Now, this may sound really obvious. Okay, somebody's having an exacerbation. It has a lot of physical characteristics. The problem is it has a lot of physical characteristics that are common with heart attack, that are common with many other things. An ability to just say, yes, you are in fact having an exacerbation, and we're going to treat you appropriately for that is hugely important. The physicians we've spoken with have all been very interested in that aspect of it. In a similar manner, when have you recovered from the exacerbation? When is it done? When can we start the old regime of drugs and get off of this sort of high level of drugs? And of course, the fifth one is the prediction of future exacerbations. So what we see here as a market opportunity is a huge gap in the current diagnostics market. So the diagnostics today are really focused on the symptoms and not the cause. So they're always going to be lagging indicators. And so it is a clear gap, and it's a gap that's very much recognized by all the physicians that we've spoken to in the field, that there needs to be something. We really think about this as something that's going to be analogous to glucose or A1C testing in diabetic patients. It's a chronic disease. You need to have those check-ins to know how to modify the treatment regime. It's similar also in some ways to troponin in cardiac patients. COP is managed. We can't cure it. So that early detection piece is very, very important. The management piece is very important. And we need to be able to get people to stop doing the things that are harmful. So if you can detect it early and you can get people to know that they're really, really, really doing damage, it can help in things like smoking cessation and other areas like that. Proteases are also currently a big focus for pharmaceutical companies who are making therapeutics for that knock down these proteases. This is a very logical area where we see some similarity of purpose. So I've already more or less touched on these. There are so this is sort of the landscape for diagnostics today. So the things in the yellow box, these are sort of the not very specific old style tests, spirometry to figure out how much volume you can expel from your lungs and so on. Pulse ox, anyone who's had COVID is quite familiar with pulse ox, and imaging as well. The others are actually looking at biomarkers, but in a sort of a very timid way. Right now, they're research use only tests that are available. They don't seem to cover the all of the areas that they really don't have the capability to cover the areas that we are planning to cover. But of course, we're very interested in the data that they generate. So let me talk about the application pipeline and talk about total accessible market. So the total accessible market calculations here are based only on the United States, and they're pretty conservative estimates. And nonetheless, I think the takeaway message is really, really clear that this is a really big market. US is about 25 to 33%, so a quarter to a third of global market. So you can, more or less multiply these by 3 or 4 to get to the global TAM. But you can see, the diagnosis of COPD, has a fairly modest TAM, 150 million. Stage and progression is much larger. Verify exacerbation and end of exacerbations of 0.7 each. And then the big one is predicting future exacerbations. And so while I don't really intend this slide to say we're going to do this first and this first and then this and then this and then this, it is likely we would take these in a sequence. But I think the thing that's really compelling about the product that we are describing here is that it for any of these applications, it's exactly the same test. There's no differences between them. It's just you need to get the data that is sufficient to provide to FDA to show that your test can do this. But there's no development of a new test for each of these. So the business model. So the business model, so what I'm showing here is a go it alone model of the universe. That means that we're developing our own instrument and our own software and our own consumable. As I mentioned before, we really hope not to have to do that. But this is the sort of pessimist model of this. Series A and Series B would go down substantially if we partnered with the right instruments. So the overall approach here is we are generating a prototype test that will give us our feasibility and early development data, some initial clinical validation, clinical utility, get to some of the health economic stuff. That same test, and we're talking about something on a 96-well plate, not a point of care thing, that can then, in a relatively short period of time, go into a CLIA lab and actually start generating a little bit of revenue for us. So it's a little bit of revenue, but it's a whole lot of data for us, which is extremely useful. And so that's one of the primary drivers to that approach. We expect by Q3 of 2024 to submit for FDA clearance. We're expecting this to be a de novo, and we're certainly hoping for a CLIA waiver on that, with a point of care launch in 2025. So the round of funding that we're talking about now, which we're currently out raising that $8.5 million, is really there to generate that prototype test. To start getting all of that analytical and clinical data that helps us really define what the optimal version of this test is. You know, what are the requirements, the markers, applications? You know, how do we put this thing together? And it also that's that prototype test that goes into the CLIA lab that generates some revenue for us. And it also helps us to really define our commercial system. You know, who are our partners for all of this, for hardware, software, consumable. Of course, have our interactions with FDA and marketing studies to drive further product definition. So all of those pieces come out in this initial set. So, you know, a very reasonable question is why NowAware? Why not somebody else? So I do think we're really uniquely positioned to take advantage of this. So we have established a platform for the detection of protease activities. We've demonstrated that works in our hands. We've built out a team that is fundamentally proficient at IVD test development. It's about a 20-person technical group, biologists, chemists, engineers, quality folks, all those. And we've got a proven method that can take the sequences of these targets of the proteases and make them better targets. And that's one of the really key and important aspects of what we've done up to this point. We can make really fantastic substrates for our test. So just sort of a high level view of the team. You guys can certainly browse this at your leisure, but Rob is our CEO. I'm Jason. John's our GC. Olivier is our head of finance, and David McDonald is a business advisor for us. A great deal of experience across the team. and very well suited for the challenge. From an intellectual property standpoint, we're taking a not too terribly unusual sort of mixed approach, patents and applications and trade secrets. We have applications that were filed back in 20 and 21 that cover the basic guts. We have additional provisional submissions that have been made to cover COPD specific aspects of the test. And we also have issued IP that we may pull from depending on exactly how we build up the various pieces. Everything else is trade secrets. There's lots of process and formulation know-how. That's we'll continue to hold those close as trade secrets. So as far as exits go, it's always a good topic. This is a test that there's interest from a lot of different directions, potentially lab services companies, hospital lab companies, POC platform companies, pharma, tobacco companies. Even it's interesting. They're doing a lot of outreach to the COPD community for a variety of reasons. Recent exits in the IVD space have been really surprising. So there have been some very large exits quite recently. Luminex, Genmark, Biotelemetry, Onmark. They've all been fairly recent acquisitions and quite sizable. So there's certainly the potential there for substantial exits. So in summary, pulmonary disease is a huge underserved market. The diagnostics, the impact of a new diagnostic here is greater than the impact of a new diagnostic anywhere else that I can think of. This is a tremendous opportunity. We've identified that unmet challenge, and I think we have the tools to approach it. In the U.S. alone, we're looking at a $5 billion total accessible market. And we think that is, that's a very, very conservative number for that. I think, looking at, we really do have that right vision, that right technology, and the right team to revolutionize COPD diagnostics and really get something that's going to help people. And I will stop there and see if there's questions.
Hey, Jason, how are you? It's Marty.
Doing well.
Great. So just give a couple of questions. Who are the payers for the product? Does insurance pay this? And I think you listed a price of, was it $50 for the test?
Yes. Yeah.
And so like how frequently is the test used? Like if you're an individual, I'm not sure if you listed how many people suffer from COPD in the US.
Yeah. So the numbers look like this. There's 17 million people in the US that suffer from COPD. Our TAM numbers were built around some different applications. So, for individuals who are very early in COPD, they're stage 1 or 2. Those are people who, the physicians that we've talked to said, 2 tests a year would be sufficient for them. For people in stages 3 and 4, where they're having frequent exacerbations and having a very hard go of it, there's 4 to 12 times a year.
So does insurance pay for this?
Yeah. So what we think, and yes, so this would be through insurance. What we think we're going to get a great deal of pull from the payers because there is so much savings to be had here. You think back to that $100 billion a year number, and 70% of it's preventable. That gives you an opportunity to get some real pull from the payers to get this on board.
Jason, I guess my question is there a payer code?
There's not a payer code at the moment. There's a spirometry payer code. So the standard the standard test right now, you go into your pulmonologist and you ask the question and he gives you a spirometry test. So spirometry is it's the existing test, and it's probably the closest. We're probably going to have to push for codes.
So what's the efficacy of the test?
We don't know yet.
When are you going to know?
We are going to know by the end of the period funded by that first dose of money, that first 8.5. We will have those studies done.
So what's the approval timeframe?
So the approval timeframe would submit in 24.
2023 in May?
2024.
May 2024?
We would, yeah, so we would submit in Q3 of 24.
So you have to get approval and then you have to get an insurance code.
That's correct. Yeah, but you can do those things in parallel. Yeah.
Okay, and that's going to cost how much money? 8 million?
So it's 8 million to get us to the A round, and the A round, which we said is variable because it depends. If we partner with a company that has the instrument already, it's obviously a lot cheaper.
Oh, by the way, can you pull down the screen share?
Yep.
Great. And so what's the most likely exit? Acquisition, SPAC?
Yeah, we're thinking we're thinking that it is acquisition. But there are other, obviously there's some other opportunities that they continue to evolve. By the time we get there, it's not sure what's going to be the most attractive.
Are most people with COPD are they people who have transitioned from having asthma, or just cigarette smokers, or people who are obese, or is there a breakdown?
So the breakdown is very, very heavily towards smokers. And so that population skews rural and skews socioeconomically poor, not hugely surprisingly. But yeah, it is almost entirely around your history of exposure to things that will generate COPD.
So there's an educational aspect to it as well.
Yes, absolutely.
It's fascinating. So let me see. So we've covered who the payer is. We've covered is it a binary decision in terms of getting approval, or is there are there levels of efficacy, or? Sure.
So I think the regulatory strategy is interesting because you've got a lot of decisions along the way. Which indications are you going for first? And so if we want to say diagnosis first, and then predicting exacerbations second, then it certainly makes a very, very different discussion with FDA, for example.
Right. So let me see. So we covered that regulatory, and who's invested? This is a Series A or a Series B, or
so this is our pre-A, and so we've had investment into establishing the platform. And so that foundation has been laid already. So
great. So fantastic. Do we have any other audience questions? So let me see here 1 second. I don't see any. So listen, Jason, this is really fantastic information. I know COPD is a growing problem, especially with an aging population, which the United States has. There's all kinds of respiratory issues that go on. And I don't have, what percent, cardiopulmonary is in terms of morbidity or mortality in this country. But I think that in terms of, mortality, it's probably one of the big 4 diseases. Is that right?
Yeah, it's the number three. So COPD itself is the number three killer. So
And the treatment for COPD is like steroids?
yeah, it's only alleviating symptoms. So essentially, you get bronchodilators and steroids, and the switch that you've really got is more or less, and that's about it.
Right.
But pharmaceutical companies are making, so AZ is making, it has in clinicals right now, what is a fairly promising protease inhibitor based pharmaceutical.